Murder, pyramid schemes, mass executions, bankruptcy litigation? The wild world of cult lawsuits presents an interesting look into how cults function and how they're brought down by the law. Today we're going to talk all about how to prosecute a cult. Thank you to the sponsor of today's video, PDS Debt. This economy is starting to feel spookier and spookier, and having your finances in order feels more important than ever. I have struggled and continue to struggle with debt. I have 2 degrees, a house, and I've started multiple businesses in the last 2 years. Life happens and debt happens, and there's nothing to be ashamed of. If you're looking for help managing your debt, PDS Debt may be able to help you. They've customized 0% interest options for people struggling with credit cards, personal loans, collections, or medical bills. Because of the last few years being so rough due to COVID, certain types of debt can be reduced or paid off much faster while saving you interest. PDS Debt is giving my qualified viewers a free debt savings analysis just for completing the 30-second online debt assessment. You can take the assessment by going to pdsdebt.com/Miller. You'll receive a full breakdown on how to save on interest each month and the quickest way to take care of your debt. So if you've been trying to claw your way out of debt, making payments every month but your balances just aren't going down, PDS Debt could be for you. They roll all of your payments into one low 0% interest monthly payment. Everyone with over $10,000 in debt qualifies, and there is no minimum credit score required. Bad and fair credit are accepted. So like I said, PDS Debt is offering free debt analysis to my viewers just for completing the debt assessment at www.pdsdebt.com/Miller. Thanks to PDS Debt for partnering with me on today's video. Okay, so let's just start this off with a nice, fun definition. What is a cult? There's an excellent podcast that I recently found called Sounds Like a Cult, where they dissect various cultural phenomenon from SoulCycle to Elon Musk and ask the hard-hitting question, is this a cult? It's hosted by Amanda Montell and 𝗬𝗓𝗓𝗏. Amanda is a linguist who literally wrote the book on cults. It's called Cultish, the Language of Fanaticism. How fun is that? Anyway, she looks at how cults use language to facilitate community and devotion. She says that cultish language does 3 things. It makes people feel unique but also connected to others. It encourages people to feel dependent on a particular leader, group, or product to the extent that life without them feels impossible, and it convinces people to act in ways that are completely in conflict with their former reality, ethics, and sense of self. The last 2 tend to be what separates a cult-like following of, say, Peloton, a cult of which I am an avid member, from more nefarious and dangerous cults like, for example, People's Temple in Jamestown. I know I could technically survive without my Cody Rigsby workouts, even though I prefer not to, whereas Jonestown cult members literally didn't survive. But more on that in a second. Anyway, I need to read the whole book. It seems really interesting, but I thought it would be fun to use that as a nice, more robust way to define a cult. However, the legal definition of a cult gets a bit murky. What's the difference between a religion and a cult? Webster's dictionary, which by the way, lawyers and judges will often look to dictionary definitions to determine the definition of something. Webster says a cult is a quasi-religious group, often living in a colony, with a charismatic leader who indoctrinates members with unorthodox or extremist views, practices, or beliefs. The same dictionary then defines a religion as a belief in a divine or supreme power or powers to be obeyed and worshipped as the creators and rulers of any specific system of belief and worship involving a code of ethics and a philosophy. Okay, so yeah, the reality is that it's not really clear. The First Amendment protects the free exercise of religion. The difference lies in beliefs versus actions. Under the First Amendment, you can ascribe to any belief system that you want. You can genuinely believe that Zorp the Surveyor, the 28-foot tall lizard, will come down and destroy the world. That's fine. The problem is when you act on those beliefs in illegal ways. The First Amendment's protections don't include illegal acts, so you can't murder someone and say it was part of a religious ritual, for example. However, a state can't pass laws that specifically outlaw practices by a religious group, unless they have a larger justification for the general good or something. For example, a city in Florida called Hialeah, Florida passed a law banning the ritual sacrifice of animals. There was only one group doing that, the Santeurian population in that town. So they sued, saying it was an infringement of their religious freedom. And the court found that the law did violate the First Amendment because it outlawed the practice in a way that clearly targeted the Santeurian population. Because it wasn't universally applied, like it didn't ban private slaughter or kosher slaughter of animals, and it wasn't passed to protect animals against animal cruelty. It was clearly targeted at the Santeurian population and therefore violated their religious freedom. Okay, so outlawing something because of religion, not cool. But committing a general crime that's applied universally throughout the community because of your religion, not cool. Got it? Great. Okay, so because of this, typically when a cult goes to court, it's because its members are being criminally prosecuted by whatever state they committed their crimes in, and the likelihood of them getting protection because of a religious belief system is slim to none. However, because of course there's always a but there is conduct that cults participate in that is kind of a legal gray area. Like, it's certainly questionable, but whether there's a criminal legal remedy for the conduct isn't clear. This can include blackmailing members into staying in the cult, hazing, and other forms of mental or physical abuse. Those can be hard to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. They can, however, result in civil lawsuits, meaning individual members of the cult, for example, can bring lawsuits against the cult and its leaders for things like personal injury claims or intentional infliction of emotional distress. In civil court, the bar is a lot lower. Instead of beyond a reasonable doubt, they just have to prove by a preponderance of the evidence that something happened, meaning that the evidence shows it's more likely than not that the abuse occurred. This is a lower hurdle than the criminal statutes, and that's part of the reason why, for example, O.J. Simpson was acquitted of the crime of murder, but found civilly liable in order to pay money for the death of Nicole Simpson to her family. Lower burden of proof, easier to win, but no criminal penalties in civil court, just monetary penalties, sanctions, injunctions, etc., but no criminal penalties in civil court. Another issue to consider is that of brainwashing. I go deep into how brainwashing as a legal claim works in my video on the Patty Hearst trial. Go watch that after this. So I won't go too in depth here, but the point is that brainwashing isn't recognized by the DSM as a mental illness, and it's incredibly hard to prove because a lot of times a brainwashed person makes repeated claims that they're not brainwashed, that they're acting of their own accord, and they have full control over their actions, like don't have a diagnosable mental illness, because again, it's not in the DSM, and they're not being visibly or directly coerced into committing crimes or other acts. Of course, brainwashing can be seen as a type of coercion, but in a court of law, there needs to be a more direct application, like a gun is being held to their head, or they were told that if you don't do this, I'll kill you and your whole family. Brainwashing doesn't tend to function like that because it comes from long and persistent and pervasive psychological manipulation, which is just impossible to prove in court. Okay, so a brainwashing defense, if someone is being prosecuted for crimes they committed as part of a cult, is a very uphill battle that likely won't work. Okay, so with all that legal background, let's take a look at a handful of cult cases. So cults were a huge issue back in the 70s and 80s, and back then there were estimates that there were 2,500 to 3,000 cults in the US alone. Literally too many to keep track of. Despite the fact that there are so many cults out there are shockingly few criminal prosecutions of cults. And in some cases, prosecutors end up dropping charges for various reasons. Perhaps the evidence is too weak because none of the cult members are willing to testify. Perhaps the cult disbands and the crimes were minor enough that they're not worth going through the prosecution with. Often prosecutors' offices don't comment on the reasons why charges are eventually dropped, however. For example, recently the group Love Has Won, which has been widely considered a cult, was located in various places, first Hawaii, then Colorado. Their leader was named Amy Carlson, and she preached love and kindness, and her followers believed she was a divine being because, well, she told them that she was a divine being. They also used electrolysis to break down metals into various solutions that the members then sold online, claiming that they were health aids. Specifically, they sold colloidal silver, which I had never heard of. It's tiny silver particles suspended in liquid. It's the same metal used in like jewelry and dental fillings and silverware. People who sell it make all sorts of health claims that have never been supported by studies published in reputable medical journals, such as that it boosts the immune system, fights infections, and treats cancer. The Love Has Won cult was selling it as a treatment for COVID-19. Yep. And Amy Carlson allegedly took so much of it that the silver built up in her system and turned her skin a blue-gray color. She was also diagnosed with cancer and was using it as a treatment for that. Anyway, obviously that didn't work and she eventually died, okay? And when she died, members of her cult allegedly took her corpse across state lines to their Colorado property, adorned her sunken eyes with glitter, put her body in a sleeping bag and wrapped it in Christmas lights, and then just left it there for an unknown amount of time. By the time a cult member notified authorities where her body was, her remains were so decomposed that they couldn't tell the cause of death. Plus, she had no fingerprint or dental records because, of course not, she's a cult leader. Anyway, 7 members of the cult were eventually charged with tampering with a dead body, abuse of a corpse, and misdemeanor child abuse because there were just kids in there with the dead body. And yes, there are laws about how to handle a body. Ask a Mortician, the YouTube channel, did a fun deep dive into this cult and the handling of dead bodies. Go watch that after this one. Anyway, for unknown reasons, a few months later, all criminal counts were dropped against all 7 of the cult members. The cult had since rebranded under a different name, though many of the members eventually scattered. So it could be that the prosecutor's office decided it wasn't worth it. Could be that they couldn't find enough evidence of who actually did it. They never gave a reason. But I highlight this case as an example of how even pretty egregious egregious actions by cult members can result in no prosecution. Which is why when a cult is criminally prosecuted, and successfully so, it makes international news. Enter 𝗦𝗂𝗡𝗦. Okay, like numerous documentaries have been made on this cult, so you likely know the backstory, but here's a quick refresher. There's this guy, Keith Raniere. We'll call him Keith, all right? He was born in New York, and apparently at the age of 12, he read the book Second Foundation by Isaac Asimov, which was all about mind control, and he was like, sick, sign me up. So his villain arc starts early. Then he goes to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and graduates with a GPA of 2.26 because he failed or barely passed most of his math and science classes, despite later bragging about taking them all the time. Like failing a class, low GPA, who gives a shit? No shame. But I highlight that because he thought he was like the smartest, deepest, most special person in the universe. Like this guy is every exceptionally mediocre white man's wet dream. Later, he took this random IQ test in a magazine called the Mega Test, which has been widely criticized as not even remotely valid. And he scored so high that he got into the Mega Society that brands itself as an exclusive, ultra high IQ society. Anyway, that was in the 80s. And during that time, he also worked in multi-level marketing companies, and he was a computer programmer for a while before founding his own MLM called Consumers Byline, which was eventually shut down as a pyramid scheme. And then he founded another MLM, this time selling vitamins, which failed 5 years later. All right, but then his crowning achievement was the next MLM that he founded, 𝗦𝗂𝗡𝗦. It was originally called Executive Success Programs and then rebranded as 𝗦𝗂𝗡𝗦. It was a personal development company that held these seminars and classes aimed at self-improvement. So it was really brilliant, only in that the type of person who's at a point in their life where they need to pay a company to help them with their confidence likely is in a rather vulnerable position and probably more susceptible to the power of suggestion. A lot of the teachings were apparently influenced by Ayn Rand, who was one of Keith's favorite authors, because of course. You can go ahead and mark that off on your mediocre white man bingo sheet if you haven't already. Okay, and a lot of the people who took these classes, you know, took one or a handful and then went on their merry way. Like it wasn't like if you took a class, you were a member of the cult. There were, however, a group of people who took Keith's teachings very seriously and treated him as this genius, all-knowing leader who they called Vanguard. And he would hire them on as apprentices to teach these self-improvement courses, and as they gained in the ranks, they would recruit their own teachers of these classes, and thus a pyramid scheme is born. However, the people in the group of followers who were teachers, especially women, for them this wasn't just a day job. They were ordered to only sleep for very few hours during the night. Mind control is easier on sleep-deprived people because they had to get up and work and train. But even though from the outside Keith seems like a textbook mediocre white man, he did truly learn the power of persuasion and manipulation. At one point, he even got in the good favor of the Dalai Lama. He also recruited Sarah and Claire Bronfman, sisters who were heirs to the Seagram's fortune, and he famously recruited Allison Mack, actress and star of Smallville. So partially due to the absolutely ridiculous nature of this cult, but also because of the fame of Allison Mack, this group started growing in visibility and notoriety. Okay, and Keith has been accused of numerous instances of assault and coercion, but the most famous and subject to the subsequent lawsuits was because of the sex cult within the MLM cult within 𝗦𝗂𝗡𝗦, also known as DOS. Keith was, of course, the grand master of that sex cult pyramid, and he recruited women to be his slave women. And then those women would recruit more women, and they would become masters, and those new women would become slaves. Like, they literally weren't even subtle about it, which I think lent itself well to a lawsuit. You really can't argue that something's benign when you're literally calling people slaves. Okay? And the slaves were required to provide services for their masters like running errands, cleaning their homes, etc. But many of them also were physically branded with the letters KR, Keith's initials, and required to engage in sexual activity with Keith. And they were kept severely sleep deprived and forced on very restrictive diets that caused them to stop menstruating and caused their hair to fall out, because Keith liked exceptionally thin women. He claimed that women with extra weight on them disrupted his sexual energy. Someone passed the cheese puffs, keep this fucking creep away from me, all right? And the slaves also had to provide collateral to their masters, something that they could use as blackmail if the slave ever revealed the existence of DOS. Again, they literally called it collateral. No subtlety. They were clearly in so deep, and Keith was so drunk with power that they were being really stupid about it. Okay, and by 2017, a bunch of former members were pushing for investigations into the group, and especially into DOS, with a report about the branding even published in the New York Times that year in 2017. So officials started investigating, And by 2018, they officially charged Keith, and he was arrested outside of Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, where he had been living for 5 months. This was a federal investigation, and you know what the feds love to do to someone who's engaged in a long-running scheme of sexual abuse across numerous state lines? They love to charge them with racketeering. I go in depth into racketeering law in my R. Kelly video because that's what he was charged with as well. But basically, racketeering law, also known as RICO, was originally passed to help prosecute the mob, because the way that the mob operated made it impossible to directly link crimes to big mob bosses, because they always had someone lower down in the organization doing their dirty work. So RICO allows for the prosecution of a person accused of orchestrating a long-standing scheme to commit crimes. So they don't have to have evidence that the person actually committed the crimes necessarily, but that they ordered the crimes to happen and were somehow involved in the orchestration of the crimes. So it's a two-layered accusation. One, that the person orchestrated a scheme, and two, the actual underlying crimes committed by that crime ring. Okay, so Keith was charged with racketeering and conspiracy for orchestrating a number of crimes, including identity theft, extortion, forced labor, sex trafficking, money laundering, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. Claire Bronfman and Allison Mack, along with a couple other members of the cult, were also charged. Allison Mack pled guilty, meaning that she didn't challenge the charges, and in exchange for her guilty plea, the prosecutors dropped the sex trafficking and forced labor charges against her. She was eventually sentenced to 3 years in prison, which is pretty much the minimum amount of time a person can be sentenced for racketeering. She likely was given a lenient sentence because she showed a lot of remorse, repeatedly apologizing for her actions, and she had no prior significant criminal record of any kind. She began serving that 3-year sentence in September 2021. Old Keith, on the other hand, he went down swinging, all right? He pled not guilty, so his case went to trial. During the trial, former members of NXIVM testified that Keith had used manipulation to indoctrinate and control his followers, and that he had retaliated with lawsuits against anyone who tried to dissent. But most of the trial was focused on DOS, that's sex slave ring, both because it's the most egregious crimes that they had, and also because they had a number of witnesses with pretty damning evidence, including pictures of the branding and text messages. Again, they literally called people slaves, so the messages did not look good. All right. Former members testified to sexual assault and corporal punishment, and one of his victims was 15 when the abuse occurred. The trial lasted 6 weeks, and the jurors deliberated for less than half a day and then found Keith guilty of all 7 counts against him, including racketeering, sex trafficking, conspiracy, forced labor, identity theft, sexual exploitation of a child, and possession of CP. So once a person is found guilty by a jury, a sentencing hearing is scheduled usually a few weeks to a couple months after the guilty verdict. At sentencing, the person's victims and their families have a right to speak, and then the defendant also has a right to speak. Then the judge hands down their verdict. It can be a really powerful moment to witness, and it helps to give victims a chance to have their voice actually heard in court before the judge makes their final sentencing decision. That testimony, plus the testimony of the defendant, can affect the sentencing outcome. For example, if the defendant clearly shows no remorse, that's an indication that they haven't learned their lesson and could commit the same crime again if given the lenient sentence. Keith's sentencing hearing lasted hours, as many of his victims came forward to give statements. When he was given a chance to speak, Keith waffled back and forth between kind of apologizing but also saying that he was innocent and that his victims were all lying. And his lawyer said that Keith never meant to hurt anyone, and he was genuinely in love with all these women and simply had trouble dealing with breakups. At one point during the lawyer's speech, the judge literally yelled at the lawyer that intent doesn't matter when a 45-year-old man sexually abuses a child, saying that it's an insult to the intelligence of anyone who listens. At the end of the hearing, the judge sentenced Keith to 120 years in prison, which was even higher than what the prosecutors had asked for. He was also ordered to pay a $1.75 million fine. Okay, so like I said, NXIVM and the subsequent criminal convictions stemming from that cult was so notable because it's so rare for criminal convictions to come from the activities of a cult, at least not of that magnitude. But civil lawsuits are much more common, and interestingly, because of the amount of money that these cults are able to manipulate their followers into giving them, the cults often have incredible amounts of assets at their disposal, and many of the civil lawsuits stemming from cult activity are actually related to their assets, not to alleged crimes that they've committed. For example, the Rajneshi Cult, subject of the hit Netflix documentary Wild Wild Country, they were hit with a number of lawsuits in the 80s from former Rajneshi members who had given the cult hundreds of thousands of dollars as loans that were never repaid. In one case, a woman named Helen Byron sued for the $380,000 loan that she made to the cult that was never repaid. That's over $1 million in today's money. The cult claimed that it was a donation. Helen won, and she won punitive damages on top of that, which is rare, especially in a contract case. Usually civil lawsuits are not meant to act as punishment, but only to make the suing party whole again. So because the court awarded Helen with punitive damages, the Rajneshi cult was ordered to pay her $1.7 million. A separate separate lawsuit by another woman who loaned $800,000 to the cult ended up pushing the cult into bankruptcy. And even in the case of probably the most horrific and notorious cult, the People's Temple cult, which ended in the group suicide of over 900 people in Jonestown in Guyana, there was only a single criminal conviction. In fact, the biggest litigation related to the People's Temple cult was bankruptcy litigation, after the massacre which happened in 1978. Because what do you do after a major US cult with significant assets results in the death of over 900 mainly US nationals in a foreign country? How do you clean that mess up? Well, that job fell on the shoulders of an attorney named Robert Fabian, who was tasked with liquidating the People's Temple's assets. It took him 4.5 years. He sold their headquarters in San Francisco, auctioned off their belongings, including Jim Jones's oak pulpit, and sold off other properties in Richmond, Watts, and Pasadena. He also had to deal with the shipment and burial of 545 bodies that were returned from Guyana to the US. 300 of those bodies were never claimed. He also had to work to find a lot of the assets that the cult owned. Most of it was located in Panamanian banks, and $1 million was found in Guyana. It was important for him to do this work because the estate of the People's Temple was subject to over 70 lawsuits, including one by the US government for reimbursement for the expenses of recovering and transporting bodies of the temple members back to the US, and also for reimbursement for unpaid taxes. The rest of the lawsuits were from individuals either wounded the day of the massacre or the families of those who were killed. The largest individual payout was $360,000 to Jacqueline Spire, who was the aide to Representative Leo J. Ryan, who Jim Jones had murdered. Spire was present and was wounded during the murder. Representative Ryan's children also received payouts, as did a number of other family members of those who died during the massacre. One temple member, Larry Layton, was charged with conspiring to murder Representative Ryan and attempting to kill Richard Dwyer, the U.S. Deputy Chief of Mission to Guyana, who was wounded in the assault. But his case ended in a mistrial in 1981, and a new trial happened in 1987, and this time Larry was sentenced to life in prison. He was the only person to face criminal prosecution for the Jonestown massacre. Okay, so obviously one video can't cover every single lawsuit that every cult has ever been involved in, but I hope this video gives you an idea of the types of legal battles that cults can get intertwined in. Either they're committing straight up murder or other actionable crimes, or a whole scheme of crimes enough that they can be charged with racketeering, or they can be involved in numerous types of civil lawsuits, especially with former members for monetary damages for everything from financial loans to personal injury to wrongful death. And then there is the cult behavior that sits in a legal gray area where the conduct is ethically dubious at best and sometimes abusive, manipulative, and worse. But it doesn't necessarily rise to criminal conduct, or there simply isn't enough evidence to get a conviction, or the members are so brainwashed that they wouldn't provide evidence even if there was any. So a lot of cults or cult-like organizations are able to fly under the radar or get away with egregious behavior by living in a legal gray area and using their First Amendment freedom of religion as a shield. What do you think? Are there cults that you think deserve to be prosecuted that are still going strong? Comment below. Now, hopefully you didn't give away hundreds of thousands of dollars to a cult, but if you're struggling with your debts and trying to figure out a way to dig yourself out of debt and feel more financially secure, PDS Debt may be able to help you. Thank you again to PDS Debt for partnering with me on today's video. Reminder to check out PDS Debt's free debt analysis by going to pdsdebt.com/Miller. Thanks, PDS Debt. If you like this video, you might also like my video all about the Patty Hearst kidnapping and trial. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye.